Uh, yeah, sure. I haven't written about DR stuff in a while. When I feel like the DR community is missing some much-needed analytical content, I tend to just go through the list of characters until I notice one who isn't talked about a lot and who I can push myself to come up with something novel to say about them. There are characters that are already quite popular and relatively frequently discussed that, like, while I don't think the community as a whole understands them entirely, I think they're close enough that I don't know, I want to talk about something fun. This is supposed to be fun, right? Like, I could talk about Kamaida in a couple of ways that other people don't, but they'd be kind of abstract, and for the most part, people get the gist of how to interpret his character, minus, like, a few certain elements and implications and the overall meta of what it means. But Angie and Mikan they're in a similar boat. The fans of these characters really like them and have a fairly nuanced grasp of what's interesting about them, more so than the average normie. But fuck it, I like Mikan. I'll talk about Mikan for a bit. Rather, I think there's a rat's nest of controversy that could be fun to poke for a bit, surrounding Mikan and surrounding, like, DR2 Chapter 3, really any Chapter 3 in the series, etc. To start with, I need to first point out that anime things such as DR exist in this paradoxical relationship with its fanbase, where, like, the game is produced out of a bunch of autists who are way too far in on the joke. They are way too absorbed. They have seen the same fucking anime gags so many times. It's the entire way. Their brain has literally become Looney Tunes. But the audience of these products is filled with a bunch of autists who are not in on the joke at all and take it all completely seriously, even when none of it is meant to be taken seriously. Everyone that is autistic enough to still, in the year of our Lord 2024, to make video essays about characters like Mikan is also so deeply separated from the inside joke of it all that they can only engage with half of the character that's available and half of their intended role in the narrative. For Mikan, this is very apparent, and I don't want to sound like I'm, like, disparaging the other people that are making videos and still talking about DR and stuff. You need some bitter fucking asshole cynic like me to cut through it. I understand that, okay? I am happy to fulfill that role. But the important point is, for Mikan, this is very apparent in a straightforward and clear element: the gag sexualization scenes. Now, I am not saying that I'm here to be like some sort of comedy police and argue that these goddamn liberals are ruining peak humor by not laughing at girl tripping and titties flopping, but the important point is, these scenes and this aspect of her character, they are intentional and not for the reasons that people think. The autistic anime fan who takes things really seriously and, not that it matters too much, but is generally extremely politically liberal and etc., they see things like this that are obviously satirical to some degree and see it as a brief moment of, like, the story's rhetoric tearing the character away from what is otherwise a totally grounded characterization that is meant to be taken 100% literally. You know, they look at and discuss and talk about Mikan as, like, an actual person with, like, actual traumatic history and real human experiences and like a real person who the narrative is harming in some way. And, you know, I'm not, like, arguing with that, but the point is that when you think about it that way, there are things that get missed, and that's what I'm here to talk about. I can explain this particular element of meta-satire, pretty easily. A lot easier than a lot of the other stuff in the series, and without too much abstract thinking to go into it. DR2 has a lot more sexual fan service than DR1 did. And there's a very clear observable pattern to it A very simple, straightforward misdirect, a play on the tropes. Every single sexual gag is a prelude that disguises a moment of actual narrative importance while tonally pretending like the scene is descending into a cheap comedic beat and thus narratively disposable. Mikan tripping in Chapter 1 is testimony-based evidence that is used to prove that Teruteru was not in the location he says he was. The swimsuit scene in Chapter 2 is a memory of a state of the individuals involved that held evidence toward the culprit's identity. These are... Mikan sleeping with Hajime is kind of looser, but it held multiple understated points of evidence towards her deteriorating health condition. The gags, they are put intentionally as bait and switches into actual meaningful plot points. They are supposed to seem... Now, you don't have to agree and think that they're good, or that it excuses the things that you dislike about them, but there is intentionality behind... there is a subtext reason for it. Not subtext, but whatever makes the comedy more or less tolerable to you, and that's your decision, knowing that it's ironic and that it is used to lower and play off of your expectations and play off of your often negative associations with certain tropes, is up to you. The point is, the writing style of the game operates in this back and forth between the serious overlaying the silly and the silly disguising the serious. Mikan has a reoccurring sexual gag, but it's secretly saying something about her actual character. Behind the veil of this crass lowball trope, there is something being said, in a serious manner by the game. Everything that other people say about Mikan is already mostly accurate, right? Like, it's not too complicated. Dependency issues, history of abuse, complex about asserting control over others. Her personality belies her actual talents, not just her academic intelligence, but also her physical endurance and strength and technicality. We can offer some subtextual implications too, like how Mikan is the only character in the cast that, other than, like, Chiaki, she's the only character in DR2 up to that point who only ever offers correct and well-reasoned arguments within the first two trials. Every other character at least offers something that is not correct, or offers a suggestion that we don't take in the previous trials. There's an unspoken element within these games, especially 1 and 2, DR1 and 2, about how the irony of the premise is that people with superhuman powers and skills and like these absolutely ridiculous concepts of people that have completely unrealistic abilities, that they are rendered useless in an environment where basic common sense is the most important talent to have. And so prowess in the trials is often correlated with who the narrative kind of is presenting as the truly most capable people. Now, the part where people go wrong in their analysis, and I can't blame the autistic anime fans completely for this, because one of the other side effects of this autism is that autists care way too fucking much about things like canon, so they will use the shitty DR3 anime when they are analyzing Mikan, which I disagree with. I find it pointless, and I think just, as a matter of course, it's my opinion that all meaningful literary analysis, art analysis of any kind should be obtained from a single source, i.e., if you're analyzing DR2, only take from the explicit evidence within DR2 and nothing else. The anime suggests that Junko uses like some fucking magic video to turn people into these evil puppets. This is clearly not what the original game was suggesting. Mikan gives us an explanation for how she was turned into a despair, and it makes sense for her personality. It clearly implies that Junko exploited her specific personality defects. It doesn't suggest some kind of broad, generic brainwashing technique. When Makoto speaks to the DR2 cast in Chapter 6 during the trial, he doesn't act like they're just innocent people who happen to be brainwashed against their will. He tells them explicitly that they, under their own autonomy, did terrible things, and he is very wary of them even now in the state they are in. They clearly all... The implication of the story is that they all clearly have the capacity for evil and being a despair. In DR2, we're only given greater detail on how Mikan and Hajime became despairs. Those are the only two that we know that we can surmise a clear chain of events. And both of them, their reasons for becoming despairs stemmed from their own personal flaws. It's entirely fair to assume that every character in the DR2 cast became a despair under their own autonomy, just through exploitation of their worst traits and their flaws. We can see this in the subtext of the premise. In DR1, the idea of the killing game is like, hey, we're gonna take these symbols of hope that are meant to be seen as like naive wish fulfillment and prove that it's all bullshit and that they have the capacity for evil and that it's actually dark and grim. And in DR2, it carries a slightly different meaning, where the killing game is a showcase of how these 15 people became despairs in the first place. It is putting them into a situation where their worst traits are becoming apparent and pushing them into acts of violence. Exactly how much capacity for violence that they already have. This is kind of an unspoken interpretation, but Junko doesn't have to be doing this in this game. She doesn't have to be doing a killing game. All she needs is to waste time and get a couple of the kids to die along the way, which she has other means of doing if she really felt like it, thanks to her ever-expanding power over the entire island, and there's a lot of very loose rules that she's bound to. She makes them do a killing game, and her stated reason is because she was baiting Makoto and the others to come in. But a subtextual reason is that she's showing that these kids are fucked up already, and that she's trying to prove to Makoto, her actual rival, that Makoto's plan to save them from themselves is idiotic. Most of the cast have traits that we can clearly observe could be exploited into at least beginning to corrupt them into a more evil version of themselves. The hardest characters to imagine being evil would be like, I don't know, the Imposter, or fucking Mahiru, etc. And Mahiru has already covered up a murder committed by her close friend. You have characters like Sonia, who seem very nice, but there's a lot of textual evidence within the game about sketchy things that she does in her own kingdom, in her own country, to her own people, and there's a general implication that she's only nice to us and the rest of the cast because she perceives them as equals in social stature here, but in her own country she would treat the common folk who are beneath her quite differently. Even fucking Nekomaru, he has his fight with Gundam. We see a scene of his fight with Gundam. He has a number of potentially meaningful lines, like how he agrees with and approves of Gundam's bloodlust and the concept of selfish killings for one's own benefit. That he would have also killed everyone to escape if he had won the fight. Multiple characters, no one denies this. He mentions that he's been a manager for so long, he's forgotten how wonderful it feels to have a violent face-off with someone, etc. He believes, he does believe in doing anything, even killing other people, in order to save his own life, and we know from his FTEs that he has a fatal heart condition, which could imply that we're meant to interpret a chain of those events that might lead to how Junko could have manipulated him. See, if you read between the lines, every single character in DR2, to greater or lesser degrees, has an implied method of how Junko could have gotten to them to at least make them spread despair. Anyways, the point is, we need to analyze Mikan not under the assumption that brainwashing exists, but instead we need to analyze her under the assumption that Mikan, under her own autonomy, wound up in the state that we see her in as a despair. We need to use that to better interpret and to understand her character. So getting back to where I started, Mikan does do the sex gags on purpose. Her skill and physical talent, her strength and coordination are distinctly implied at multiple times. She is not someone who actually makes clumsy mistakes. It doesn't make sense for her talent, and multiple characters who are treated as diegetic narrators confirm that clumsiness is not an aspect that she actually suffers from. The game has a lot of lines and a lot of implications that Mikan fakes her clumsiness and fakes things to draw attention to herself, We already understand that Mikan behaves in the way that she does because she is attention craving, even negative and hostile attention. We can also tell from some of her lines and her stalker-like tendencies that come up in her FTEs and other areas, and her despair transformation, that she is a highly sexual character. She does these acts to garner sexual attention intentionally, and she has a mixture of romantic and sexual fantasies. Whether you think this merits a reading between the lines, that she's reacting to traumatic effects of potential sexual abuse that are not entirely confirmed, you are free to interpret as you see reasonable. Mikan does offer to take off her clothes on at least 2 occasions, with at least some implication that she was made to do this in past social interactions in her life, or offer sexual gratification. It's not an accident that the line that she says, "Forgive me," she says a lot during those gag scenes, is the same line that she repeats as a despair during the trial. She says it over and over. These scenes are made to be, and we connect these elements, they are significant to the character. Sex is significant to the character. It is part of the character that was written. The part where people who oversimplify the character a bit get it wrong is when they argue that Mikan is just a nice girl who only ever did bad things because she was forced to through brainwashing, or like a personality-changing disease that robbed her of her own willpower. And this is a huge misread of the character. The point where Mikan, as a character, is meant to break away from your expectations of her archetype is that she does have malice. She does carry resentment. Even before she does a despair, she has moments of malice in the game or reveals things about herself and her motives that are part of a hidden desire to inflict control over other people and to observe them in a state of being weaker than her, and some of these have a more malicious vibe than others. Now, her actual intentions are not to harm people, ultimately, but she is resentful. She does have those feelings, at least, not that she acts on them. Now, obviously, I'm not trying to paint the character as like a villain or anything. It's more reasonable and believable that she would feel some sort of resentment, even unjustified resentment, towards the people around her who contribute to her constant feelings of persecution, judgment, and hatred. She constantly perceives the people around her as judging her and being uncomfortable around her. Hajime explicitly points this out in her FTEs, that she is actually extremely keen in her analysis of other people's emotional states. Part of her talent is having this fantastic, intuitive understanding of people and their conditions. And this skill has had a detrimental effect on her life, because it allows her to accurately recognize every tiny little detail in someone's behavior that indicates that they're judging her or that they're off-put by her presence. Hajime remarks in the FTEs that even when he's trying to be as nice as possible and make her feel comfortable, he just feels uncomfortable around Mikan, and he admits that Mikan is so fucking sharp and aware of how he's thinking and what he's thinking, how he's feeling, that he cannot hide his discomfort and his own social anxiety in not knowing what to do or say around someone like Mikan. Her personality is like this self-defeating loop. Her personality is very extreme, and she makes people uncomfortable because her personality is so extreme and off-putting, but her personality isn't normal because she is so keenly aware of people judging her all the time, which just makes it worse. As I've said in other videos on the DR2 cast members, DR2 has its own unique take on the ultimate talents compared to 1, where each character's lives are tangibly made worse in some way by their overwhelming talent that they cannot shut off. Hajime's life is affected by his lack of talent, Kamaida's life is ruined by his luck talent in almost every way imaginable, the imposter has a monologue or 2 about how his talent, and Chiaki talks about how talents are a crutch and they put you on this path and things like that. She talks about that in Chapter 5. Imposter says that his talent makes it impossible for him to be a normal person with a normal, real identity, etc. Every character in DR2, they're all presented as at least arguably a net negative in each of their lives, where the skills that they were born with have made them worse in some way, or made their life experiences worse in some way. In Mikan's FTEs, it becomes clear to Hajime that Mikan's talents have created the circumstances that contribute to her unhealthy mental state. For some characters, I talked about in my Akane analysis video, whether their talent is more of a blessing or a curse is sometimes difficult to determine, and there are thin lines between some of the pros and cons. After all, Mikan explains that she got into nursing because of physical abuse that she suffered from, so it posits a dilemma as to whether her terrible circumstances created her talent, or whether her talent could have contributed to her circumstances. After all, in this universe, as Komaeda says, which is actually true in this universe, most of the talents are things that the characters are literally born with. They are literally magically different from other people in the implied meta of this universe. Also, the talents are not always like one-to-one with what they achieve recognition for. Like, Akane's actual skill is clearly her supernatural instincts, her mental and physical instinct, quote-unquote, gut reaction, quote-unquote, that tells her omnipotent pieces of information, but she's loosely regarded and loosely considered an ultimate gymnast, even though nothing else about her personality or talents or anything are dedicated to the craft of gymnastics. And we are told multiple times that she does a shit half-assed job with it most of the time, and that she's kind of a second-rate ultimate at the thing that she's actually an ultimate of. But she does have a real true talent, it's just not exactly what her title is. Is the core of Mikan's talent based in medicine? Or is it something adjacent that contributes to her profession but also affects her life direction? All of that is a more esoteric debate as far as I'm concerned. The major point is, the story is clearly suggesting that Mikan's talent for analyzing people and analyzing people's current conditions does contribute to her sense of social anxiety through her impossibly sensitive social radar for when people are uncomfortable. Now, as for her romantic and sexual fantasies, we can see this as acute loneliness, as a desire for companionship, or we could see this as a byproduct of potential sexual abuse, or perhaps it is a separate aspect of her personality, just because it is, just because she likes romance or sex, whatever. Now, a big part of how the story and Hajime's internal monologues and talks about Mikan is in regards to her autonomy, which people have talked about. Yes, she is a very tragic victim of the actions of many bad actors throughout her life. But if we ascribe everything wrong with her, everything wrong, like every personality flaw that she has, and everything wrong that she does, if we describe everything wrong with her to the things that she suffered from at the hands of other people, then are we giving her the autonomy that she deserves as a human being? The end of the FTE is Hajime just repeating the line, "It's not her fault," over and over, and this, in my opinion, can seem to come across as a bit condescending. Like, it's difficult in that both things are true at the same time, and they should be true. The things that are wrong with her are clearly the fault of other people, but at the same time, people constantly underestimate her, they don't treat her with the respect and autonomy that she deserves, even though she's extremely smart, extremely strong, capable, and driven individual. How can we manage our own cognitive dissonance at the idea of not giving people autonomy when we see their behavior as a result of victimhood to other people, but also we give people autonomy when we want to respect their efforts and their talents, and positive aspects of a person? You know, I just watched Baby Reindeer very recently, and despite it being a fantastic show, great show, this was by far and away my biggest issue with it, was that I could not get over my cognitive dissonance over the idea that the show has someone in it who is a victim of terrible things and who was failed by many of the systems of society that are supposed to help people, but who is also an adult who is doing terrible things right now, and the show wants me to it wants me to forgive her for her violent crimes and her other hateful traits because she's a victim of some vague, unclear experiences, and not see her as actually responsible for the bad things that she's doing. And I find that pretty ableist, if I'm being honest. I don't like the idea that people with mental illnesses or people with trauma are treated like dogs that can't know any better if they do something wrong. As an adult who has conditions but isn't debilitated enough that you can't seek help for yourself and recognize that you're doing something wrong, it is your responsibility to improve yourself if, for whatever reason, you are a shitty person doing shitty things. I mean, like, Mikan, right? Mikan's a fucking badass, okay? Absolute fucking queen. Total bad bitch. I don't want to rob her of that autonomy and say, and say that she is who she is because of the things done to her by other people, diminish her qualities and her wonderfulness as an individual by only ascribing her victimhood and not personhood. So then I ask myself, where do we draw the line, right? Where do we draw the line in terms of personality traits and faults as a result of victimhood? Allowing people their own autonomy to be respected and judged as adults who should fucking know better than to do the bad things that they're doing. Like, Mikan is an incredibly talented and mostly good-natured person, and I don't want to associate her skills and her good traits with things that her abusers did to her. But if we claim that all of her personality defects are totally 100% the fault of her abusers and not on her, then what about her medical skills, which she also obtained as a result of said abuse? Where do we draw the line for the autonomy of people who are meaningfully transformed by victimhood into the people they are today? And from the context of the current events in DR2, we can see that there is a path. There are choices, okay? There are choices that a person makes actively. They are not just cursed to be the result of whatever bad things happened to them in the past. Mikan is at a crossroads. She could become the Mikan who was our friend in the series, but instead she became the Despair Mikan through other choices and other actions. But again, it asks the same question. Junko, another abuser, another manipulator and abuser, comes in and influences her to make her worse. How much do we or should we judge a person for their own autonomy, making their own decisions, versus how much influences of abusers like Junko take away their autonomy? I think this is why Mikan was the character out of the entire cast, the one character that we see in her despair form. Because her entire character asks a very important question that is related to the whole cast, knowing that they become ultimate despairs, and that they all have done unspeakably terrible things. But yeah, Hajime says it's not her fault, Despair Mikan says that it's everyone's fault, and she's like this, and that she takes no responsibility for it at all. That's what Despair Mikan says in after the trial. And in a way, this is probably part of what allowed her to take the next steps into being evil, I guess. Of being given the excuse that she has no autonomy because she's a victim, therefore she can do anything no matter how evil, and it's not her fault. She can do whatever she wants without judging herself because it's the fault of other people. And that's basically what her Despair Mikan says. It's not my fault. Hey, I can do whatever. Kill anyone. It's not my fault. Other people made me this way. She's given herself this extreme victimhood excuse in order to allow her to double down on her worst traits and not strive to be better and not strive to be autonomous as a person. This is clearly a meta message from the game about how characters who only exist to be victims in stories are misguidedly robbed of their sense of autonomy, and that we have to draw a line somewhere and treat characters as people who make decisions about their own lives, people who are making choices and are influenced, but ultimately at least some percentage of their choices is the result of them making the choices. She goes from being way too hard on herself for her shortcomings to completely excusing herself from the blame under the claim that everything wrong with her is the fault of other people, which are two polar opposite, completely unhealthy extremes in different directions. I also wanted to put this in here somewhere, but while everyone is aware that characters in these games are usually operating on existing tropes, both in anime as a whole and in like the series itself has a lot of similar characters, people often don't really get where they should be drawing the connections between the cast members. For the record, these three characters are part of a set: Toko, Mikan, and Miyu. They all represent different approaches to writing a character with very similar core elements and tropes. These three are highly sexual, have trauma and abandonment issues, were victims of bullying, exhibit stalker-like obsessive behaviors over people that give them attention. They are resentful, they are socially off-putting, they have complexes over the way they think people see them. All three have had an abusive relationship with another character within the narrative: Toko with Tsugami, Mikan with Junko, and Miyu with Oma. Toko had traumatic experiences that created her alternate personality. Mikan, you could say, either became who we see her as because of her past, or you could say this comparison is meant to refer to how Mikan changed after Junko and became a despair, and Mikan completely changed from some version of herself that we never see to how we see her now after a near-fatal car accident, which where she may or may not have been literally augmented by some scientist or something. But in any case, clearly changed from the head trauma, her personality and the way her brain works. Miyu and Mikan both have the same interaction where they get flustered in a social situation and then they offer to remove their clothes in like the exact same way. It's through their technical similarities that we're meant to study them and see what we can learn about their differences, learn from their differences. Amateur analysts will often make this mistake when they look for character foils because they think foils are determined by characters who feel similar to each other. Not the case. Foils are typically the result of characters who technically are very similar, but who feel very different from each other. The most noteworthy contrast that pops out to me between these three characters is Toko and Miyu are socially anxious people who respond to their own social anxiety with hostility and aggressive behavior towards other people, whereas seemingly Mikan is a non-confrontational person who would never behave in such an aggressive way, or at least very rarely. So it seems, right? But the cleverest aspect of the DR series is how it hides a ton of subtext in these compare and contrasts that you can do with all the characters back and forth. What are these foils actually implying about Mikan and her actual attitude? If Toko and Miyu respond to their inferiority complexes with instant hostility towards anyone that even accidentally makes them feel judged or put upon in a social context, then it logically stands to reason that it's not that Mikan holds no animosity over her frustrations and her feelings of social judgment from everyone, it's that she holds it all in while it grows and metastasizes inside her. Obviously, we can spend the whole day doing these comparing contrasts with the foils in this series. Toko has been conditioned to assume judgment and persecution from everyone, even if she's completely wrong about that judgment and persecution. Mikan isn't assuming things about other people. She is, in fact, extremely aware of exactly how everyone is judging her and weirded out by her all the time. Because of her talent. Miyu behaves like an asshole preemptively, both as an excuse for why she's judged socially, and as a false show of confidence that she doesn't care what people think about her, but also she is genuinely that dumb and socially inept that she literally does not understand how inappropriate her behavior is, and why it's off-putting to people, embodying the extremes between her vulgar adult mind and her immature childishness. That is most of what I wanted to say about Mikan, but I also briefly wanted to talk about the despair disease. People claim that it makes people do things that they would never do under their own decision-making, but at least how it plays out in Chapter 3, the disease does not make Mikan evil, it just allows her to remember that she is evil. It didn't turn her into something, she already was that, and it just revealed that to us through her memory coming back, which, as we already saw, is not necessarily only because of the disease. it is technically possible for them to recover their memories by themselves anyways, because Hajime in the same fucking chapter remembers things that were supposed to be erased from his memory. He remembers things from his past that were erased about being in the reserve course, and later on, he remembers things on his own, not because of his disease or anything that happens to him. He just remembers some time that he spent as Izuru. So, yes, it is technically possible that this just could have happened to Mikan even without the despair disease. It is possible for their memories to return. But anyways, yeah. Not completely impossible, and it is the real Mikan. It is just her in the future, and we learn a lot about her from this interaction. The other diseases, like Ibuki and the rest of them get, yeah, whatever, I don't know about that shit. But we don't learn a ton about what they would or would not have done under the influence of those diseases, but Mikan is not like a cop-out. It's her under her own autonomy as her future self, which she became under her own autonomy, and it is absolutely vital for the story that we see and interact with at least one disparate version of one of the characters at some point. So this had to happen to someone, and Mikan, narratively, it makes the most sense for it to happen to her. So that it has this impact, and it teaches, it gives us these elements that we need to know about the despairs. Also, last thing, this is like top 5 favorite moments in DR2 for me, top 5 best shit, when Mikan does what no one else in the game can, and she fucks up Komaeda with a burn that cuts straight to his fucking soul.
Hey.
This is the only moment in the game where Komaeda loses the argument with someone and just shuts up. It's amazing. Fucking queen shit. And again, this also speaks to her superhuman ability to read people and their ailments and their insecurities. Only she, using her specific talent, is capable of throwing Komaeda off guard by hitting him where he actually hurts, where no one else can interpret him. No one else in the cast, at least, can interpret him that precisely. Anyways, that's about it. See ya.